let's get into it. Today's lecture is on tissues, which, remember, tissues are collections of cells that all have a similar structure and function. So the same type of cells, put them together, that gives you a tissue. If you put a bunch of tissues together in the levels of organization, remember, you get organs, right? So like your heart, for example, is made up of many different tissue types that have different jobs and roles within the organ itself. So, as I said, tissues are groups of cells with a similar structure and function, and there are 4 types of tissues that we are going to discuss in your body. Those are epithelial tissues, or epithelium, connective tissues, nervous tissue, and muscular tissue. And each of them have specific characteristics that define them. And within each major category, there are a lot of different subcategories of tissues as well, all of which you are going to kind of become intimately aware of and be able to tell which tissues which, just based on looking at images of those tissues. So epithelial tissues are the first tissue type. We're going to start there. Those are found in a lot of different areas of your body. Usually they're covering different parts of your body. So the classic example of epithelium would be your skin, the outer layer. You have a bunch of little bags and things that your organs sit in, and the top layer of tissue as well that the organs have. Those would all be examples of epithelial tissue. And there's also glandular tissue, which makes up epithelial tissue as well. So the purpose or function of epithelial tissues is to protect, right? Because it's on that outer surface. Think about your skin, both inside of your esophagus and your mouth, but also on the skin on the outside of your body. It specializes in absorption. So think about areas where you absorb things, such as nutrients in your digestive tract, or where you are diffusing vital gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. It's involved in filtration, which is involved in your kidneys and things. We don't talk as much about that role as through the scope of the different types of tissues we look at, and even the body systems we cover, because we usually don't get into the urinary system. And then secretion, which is the production of something. So like your skin produces oil and sweat. Your digestive system and your respiratory system produces mucus. So those are the purposes of epithelial tissues. Now, what are the characteristics of them? So how can we tell epithelial tissue when we look at it? So these cells fit closely together, meaning that they're cells stacked upon cells. There's nothing else really there. There's no extra stuff outside of the cells, which we'll talk about when we get into connective tissue. So they're just, think about like a brick wall. Again, the bricks are the cells. The tissue layer will always have one free surface, meaning that it anchors to something, but then the other surface is not in connection with any other tissue type. They call it that sometimes the apical surface. It's the top surface. And then that, as I said, that lower membrane, which we call the basal membrane, is attached to other types of tissues. So when you think of your skin, right, you have your out or epithelial layer that then anchors to lower tissue types that are mostly connective tissues and things like that. And another important thing that is a characteristic of epithelial tissue is it is avascular. Avascular means there's no blood vessels directly going into it. So it always relies on diffusion cell to cell. You want to remember that. So they're avascular, so they have no blood supply. And that is also why these epithelial layers have to be very thin in most parts of your body. So we classify the epithelium. So that's one way we can tell epithelium in general, but we classify it based on the number of cell layers that are there, which means that like if there's one layer, it's called a simple epithelium. If there's multiple layers, 2 or more, they call that stratified epithelium. So you want to draw these kind of pictures in your notes. You have to pause the video at this point so you can draw them. But you can see that one layer here in the simple epithelium and the multiple layers here in the stratified epithelium. You also have that apical surface on top of both of them, and then the basement membrane that it all anchors to. So we also classify epithelium not only on the number of layers, but the shape of the cells themselves. So squamous or squamous, you could say it either way. Those are flattened cells. So they're I think squished. That's how I remember that. Cuboidal cells are about as tall as they are wide. Are they perfect cubes? Not necessarily, but they're just about as tall as they are wide. And then columnar cells are much taller than they are wide. like a column, essentially, right? So you want to, again, want to draw each of those in your notes as well: squamous or squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. And now let's get into the specific tissue types. So when we're going to name these things, they're pretty much combinations of the number of layers and the shape of the cells. So the first one we're going to get into is simple squamous or simple squamous epithelium. That is a single layer of flat cells. Easy, right? If we know how to define the two characteristics found in the name. And these fine line membranes that are very thin and usually specialize in diffusion. So places like the alveoli of your lungs, which are the air sacs of your lungs, the capillaries that are found in your tissues, also connecting to the alveoli of your lungs, to specialize in the absorption of vital gases, things that have to freely and quickly diffuse. These also line up what they're called serous membranes that are like the bags that your organs sit in. So what you want to know, again, one layer of flat cells. Where do we find them? Commonplace lungs. That's the easiest. Remember, specializes in diffusion because they're so thin. You can see here, these are each flat individual cells here that form these air sacs in your lungs. Simple cuboidal epithelium, again, a single layer of cube-shaped cells, cells that are about as tall as they are wide. These are common in ducts in their glands. You'll find them in kidney tubules. They'll find them on the covering of ovaries. But what's sometimes hard to tell here, I'm going to try to draw this out for you here. Let's see. You can see here, so here is the basement membrane right there. And then the cells, and this is a little thicker than I'd like, but the cells are coming off like that. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not doing a great job of drawing this, but you can kind of get the idea. Those cells that are surrounding the ducts are about as tall as they are wide. Are they perfect cubes? No. But you a lot of times will see this kind of pattern of these little tiny circles that are little ducts. And surrounding that duct are these cube-shaped cells. Now we get into simple columnar epithelium. Simple columnar epithelium is about as tall as it is wide, or excuse me, is taller than it is wide. That was simple cuboidal. This includes goblet cells, which are the cells that produce mucus. These also line your digestive tract. So you can find these in your respiratory tract too. But your digestive tract does produce a lot of mucus in order to kind of lubricate the food as you swallow it so it can move easily and slide through the digestive tract, really without you thinking of it at all. And again, you can see here how the cells are much taller than they are wide, right? And there's the column shape of the cells there. We have our basement membrane here. We have our free surface right here. And this, again, I'm going to go back real quick to the cuboidal cells too. Again, free surface right in the middle of the duct, right there, and the basement membrane on the outside, as I mentioned. Okay, now we get into the an epithelial type that isn't named exactly for the number of layers and the shape, though it kind of is. So pseudostratified. Pseudo means fake. So it looks like it's stratified because if you look at the nuclei here up at the top, they're all kind of staggered. They're bouncing around, right? So it looks like it's multiple layers, but notice each one of these cells is attached to the basement membrane. Some cells are taller, some are shorter. And a lot of times you'll see this as ciliated epithelium. You'll see this kind of hairdo on the top, right? And the cilia move the mucus around because these also are involved with the the respiratory tract. And that's where you find it, is mostly in the trachea. And that, as I said, the cilia move the mucus around. But again, it's called what it's called because it looks like it's stratified, but it's not. It's actually fake stratified. And that's why it's called pseudo-stratified. And usually it's ciliated epithelium. So for this, look for the staggered nuclei, that's at the bottom. You can see the nuclei are all in different places here. But also you have the cilia on top there as well. Stratified squamous or stratified squamous epithelium is now multiple layers of flat cells. So notice at the beginning, they look almost cuboidal at the bottom, but as they go towards the apical surface or that free surface, they flatten themselves. These are found in places where friction is common, so your skin to help protection, but also your mouth. And the difference between your skin and mouth epithelium is that your skin is a moist epithelium, or excuse me, your skin is a dry epithelium, where your mouth and esophagus are wet epithelium. So the difference is that your skin is keratinized, and that is a tough, waterproof protein that helps to strengthen the skin. But as it approaches the top surface, it actually ends up killing the cells. There's also the non-keratinized version, which you find in your mouth and your esophagus. Again, multiple layers of flat cells, and you can see again, they flatten more as they get towards the top. This is our bottom layer right here. So that's the basement membrane. We have our free surface up here, and they flatten as we reach the top. And if it is keratinized, it actually dies. And we're going to, in our lab, look at what keratinized epithelium looks like. There's usually flat, shingle-like cells. They tend to stain in a different color than the rest of the cells as well. There are other stratified epithelium, like stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar, 2 layers of cuboidal cells or stratified columnar cells, but usually there's not a lot of layers of these cells, more than 2. And these are rare epithelium, so we don't actually even look at them under the microscope or anything like that in our lab. But so you want to know, these are found in the ducts of large glands, and they are rarer in the human body. Okay, so that's only the characteristic that you have to know about them. Multiple layers of cube-shaped or columnar cells, usually only 2, and they are rare in the human body, and they're found in the ducts of large glands. So glandular epithelium, we're not going to look at this under the microscope either, but this is when cells produce a product of some sort. That's what a gland does. So there's 2 major types. There's endocrine glands, which produce hormones that are released into the blood. They're ductless. They directly have usually have a blood supply that when the cells produce their hormone, it goes right into the blood. And then you have exocrine glands, which usually empties whatever they produce into a duct, and then it empties onto an apical surface. So, for example, like sweat glands, oil glands, which are called sebaceous glands, salivary glands, glands that produce enzymes in your digestive tract, for example. So those are all types of glandular epithelium. Again, we're not going to really look at those, but you want to know their characteristics. All right, so that was epithelial tissue. Now we're getting into connective tissue. This is the second major tissue type. So again, kind of like separate all the tissues we talked about previously, and now this is a different type right here. These are found everywhere and widely distributed in the body. The job of connective tissue is to bind tissues together, so like hold them in place. They help to support your body. They provide protection. But most importantly, they have this thing which is called the extracellular matrix. And the extracellular matrix, think of it like where, in contrast with the epithelial tissue, where the cells are stacked upon cells. In connective tissue, there are cells, but then they produce or like build a house that they live in, which is made up of non-living material. Think it's just as your house would be non-living. So they live in that. They're not just cells upon cells. There's a cell, and then it produces something outside of it, and that gives the individual connective tissue its characteristic. We cannot use blood supply as a characteristic for connective tissue because some have great blood supply, some do not have great blood supply. It really depends. But all of them have extracellular matrix. Remember, that is the non-living stuff that cells secrete, that they live in, that gives the characteristic tissues. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Matrix, but there's an ode to that. So the extracellular matrix is 2 main things. It has ground substance, which is water and adhesion proteins, so the cells can stick to it. And then you have fibers that are produced by the cells that really give, it's different combinations of these fibers and different concentrations that give the individual connective tissue its characteristics, its strength, that kind of thing. There are 3 types. There's collagen fibers, elastic fibers, which are really like flexible fibers, and then there's reticular fibers, which are really found mostly in reticular connective tissue. They can be found in others as well. But so you don't have to really know the individual fibers themselves. Connective tissue types. So here's our first one. This one's always easy to identify, in my opinion. Remember, you're going to have to be able to identify all of these: epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous tissue under the microscope and by picture. So bone is another term for bone is osseous tissue, and that the job of bone is to provide obviously protection, but also support. Think of it like the tree trunks that allow us to stand up against gravity. And what makes this so easy to memorize, I think, is the fact that this does look like tree rings when you look at this. So you have these circles, and when we get into bone, we'll talk about this more when we get into the skeletal system specifically. This central canal has blood vessels and nerves running through it. There's individual cells in each of these little cracks right here. They're called lacunae. And that is mostly matrix, though. So the cells reside in these cracks, right? But everything outside of it is made up of mostly calcium matrix, which provides the structure and support that you need. So again, cells living in the non-living stuff, they secrete. Next type, there's going to be 3 cartilage types we talk about, is hyaline cartilage. The way I remember this is it looks like a lazy river. It looks like these are inner tubes floating in kind of a smooth-looking pool of water. And this is mostly made of like collagen fibers and things like that. This cartilage, think of it like almost like a flexible plastic, a hard flexible plastic. You will find this in lining your joints. That's what prevents rubbing between joints. You find it in your on your rib cage. If you fetal skeleton is made almost entirely of hyaline cartilage, actually. But yeah, so this, you want to remember, these are called chondrocytes. They sit in these little holes. There's the cell. This is all the matrix that they're, producing. And this provides a frictionless surface to allow for bones to kind of slide past each other. So think of this again, lazy river. That's how I remember it. Then there's elastic cartilage, which is my favorite one to identify, actually. Elastic cartilage is made of a bunch of elastic fibers, which stain as this dark black or purple color. And this provides structural support, but that's very flexible and movable. So think about like your ears and the tips of your nose. That's much more flexible than, say, the hyaline cartilage that lines your bones and prevents friction. So I always think this looks kind of creepy, actually. It looks like a nightmare. That's how I remember it. It looks like, especially if you have trypophobia, which is that fear of like holes or repeating dots. But you can see the elastic fibers here. You can see the individual cells and the chondrocytes. Again, and even in contrast with the hyaline cartilage previously. You can see this is a little bit more smooth looking. This one looks a little bit spookier and creepier because of those elastic fibers. So I remember elastic cartilage, which is found in your ear and your nose, is a nightmare. That's how I remember it. And in contrast to that, the third type of cartilage is fibrocartilage, and a lot of times it's stained with pink and blue. And you'll see it looks almost like cotton candy, or I think as a dream in contrast to a nightmare that the elastic cartilage looks like. Fibrocartilage is found in some specific joints, but most importantly, probably, it would be the discs of your back between your vertebrae. These discs, which you can see up here, provide cushioning and flexibility for your spine. You can rupture or you can herniate those discs if you put too much pressure on them. I kind of have that issue going on currently for a large part of my life. I joke constantly about my back issues, but this is called fibrocartilage. This looks much more like parallel fibers compared to like the elastic cartilage, which it was more like the fibers were everywhere and they were kind of creepy looking. There's no they're all in random directions. Fibrocartilage tends to run in a very parallel direction, as you can see here with these fibers. Again, they look a little like cotton candy or a dream, and that's the easiest way I can remember it. And you find these between the disc or found in the discs, which are between the vertebrae in your spine. The next connective tissue type is dense connective tissue. These are your tendons and ligaments. There's also dense regular and dense irregular connective tissue. Dense regular is the kind that is very parallel, very densely packed collagen fibers. These are really tough. Think of them like rope almost. And their job is, as I said, is to provide that attachment point for muscles to bones or bones to bones, depending on if it's a tendon or a ligament. The way I remember this, it looks like a wave, kind of. You can see because they're so parallel, and when they're not tight or taut, they tend to kind of like bunch up a little bit, so they look wavy. The dense irregular, similar. You'll see the waves, but they're running in all different directions. It's not just one direction. You'll see dense irregular connective tissue in like the dermis of your skin, for example. So that is where you find dense connective tissue. Remember, that one's a wave. Areolar connective tissue or loose connective tissue. This is not a wave, but a rave. That's how I think of it. It looks kind of like these are laser beams or something. I don't know. You can use whatever way you want to remember these. I don't care. These are just ways that I kind of think of them. So this is much a softer connective tissue. This is the most widely distributed connective tissue. It's found also in the dermis of your skin with the dense irregular. But it's more supple, I guess, soft and pliable. But I think of it as a rave. You can see these reticular fibers. You can see the collagen fibers running in all different, or elastic fibers, not reticular fibers, excuse me, collagen fibers. But they're all running in all random directions. So it's more, it's not as densely packed as the dense connective tissue is. So remember, dense connective tissue, wave. Loose connective or areolar connective tissue, rave. Again, laser beams. And then adipose tissue, this is your fat tissue. This is actually easy to kind of get confused with, I would say, simple squamous or simple squamous epithelium. But instead of air in those open spaces, there's actually fat droplets. So this is where you have your like stored fats, triglycerides, things like that. And in this tissue, when you are at some point pretty early on in your life, you have all of the fat cells that you'll ever have, and all they do is get larger and smaller. So like think of it, so if you gain weight or gain body fat, those openings get bigger because they fill with more stored fat, and then when you lose fat, they shrink. And it happens kind of evenly throughout the entire body. Like everyone genetically may have some differences between how body fat is stored and the location of their cells. But in this case, you really can't spot reduce fat. You can gain muscle in a spot, but these all shrink and grow kind of in unison with each other throughout your entire body. And its purpose is to store fuel, also provide a layer of insulation on your body as well. And this is found anywhere you'd find fat in your body. Think of this one, the way I remember this one, it looks like bubble wrap. Then there's reticular connective tissue. I don't have any examples of this in the lab that we're going to do, but reticular connective tissue, to me, looks like a cherry blossom tree. Like if you were to lay under a tree or something and look up through the sun, it kind of looks like these are the branches, and you can see all the leaves and that kind of thing. Or grapes, if you want to remember it that way, it looks kind of like that. This is found in lymphoid organs like your spleen and lymph nodes. Bone marrow will have this type of connective tissue in it, and it looks like, as I said, a cherry blossom tree or bunches of grapes. Fun fact, blood is your only liquid or fluid connective tissue that you have. So you have cells, like the blood cells, platelets, that kind of thing. And then you have the matrix, which is the blood plasma, and the fibers will only really appear when the blood starts to clot itself. And its function is to transport materials around the body, obviously, right? Nutrients, carbon dioxide, waste products, and then oxygen gas, which is important for cellular respiration to create energy. So is our nutrients like glucose. But as I said, it is the only fluid connective tissue. And when we zoom out on this, blood looks like blood. They look like these little circles with lighter color in the middle. That's because it kind of pinches in the middle. It's a thinner membrane there. And that's all to increase the surface area to carry oxygen. And that's what these red blood cells do. These larger cells that are stained usually purple-ish in color, those are your white blood cells. And then your platelets are these tiny fragments. We'll talk much more about blood when we get into that much later in the year. But again, its function is to transport materials throughout your body. And also heal wounds once you cut yourself, which is what the clotting factors do. All right, those are your connective tissues. So those are all the subtypes of connective tissues you're going to be required to know. Now we're into our muscular tissue or muscle tissue. And there's 3 of these types that you have to know. Its function is always to produce movement by contracting, but there's different characteristics of different muscle types. There are three main types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth, and they all vary in the characteristics of, are they voluntary, meaning can you control them consciously, or involuntary, meaning you can't control them consciously, or are they striated, which is a texturing and banding that has to do with overlapping filaments that are found within the muscle fibers themselves, which we'll look at when we look at the individual types now. So the first one is skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscle is striated, meaning it has that texturing. You can see that it looks like it's striped. That's what striations are. These always connect to dense connective tissue, to bone and things like that. They are also voluntary, meaning that you can think about these muscles and contract them. So if I think about, I want to contract my bicep, for example, I'm going to move my arm, and I can stop whenever I want to, and I can start whenever I want to. That's what voluntary means. They also have more than one nuclei per cell, because they're a bunch of fused cells that eventually become one giant cell. You can see these nuclei here, and they're always very parallel, usually. So you'll see them running kind of in straight lines with those striations. That is in contrast with cardiac muscle, which is still striated. You can see the banding or the texturing here, but it is involuntary. I cannot decide when I want my heart to beat. I can't say heartbeat now and now and now. It doesn't work that way. They also have these dark lines called intercalated discs that help to spread the signal throughout the heart without innervation, meaning your heart actually does not need neural input in order to have cause it to beat itself. That is in contrast with every other muscle in your body does need neural input. But they only have one nuclei per cell. So as opposed to many nuclei per cell like skeletal muscle does. And the way you can tell, you can see how branchy it is. You can see how it's kind of like branching out in different directions. It's not as parallel as the skeletal muscle is. The last muscle type is smooth muscle. This is not striated and involuntary. This one's kind of hard. Sometimes you get it confused with like dense connective tissue, but sometimes they won't be running in perfect parallel. You'll have these long cells here, and then they'll kind of like branch a little bit. I think that's, as I said, that's one of the harder ones to tell the difference between like a dense connective tissue. But there are no visible striations, and they do these rhythmic contractions. So when they contract to kind of like, usually they line hollow organs like tubes in your body, and the job is to, like in your digestive tract, squeeze the food down your digestive tract without you thinking about it. You can't decide, I want to digest a hamburger now. It doesn't work that way. But eventually you eat it, and it goes through your entire digestive tract, and then you poop it out. You don't even think about that happening. And I can't like force myself to like move food through my digestive tract. I can't think about that. So it's involuntary. Again, you can't see the striations, so it is unstriated or not striated as well. You also will find these in your blood vessels as well, to help you to vasodilate and vasoconstrict, depending on if you want to regulate your blood pressure, increase it or decrease it, depending on the circumstances that you're in. And the last tissue type is your nervous tissue. There's only one major type of this. There's a bunch of support cells that surround it, and then you'll have these neurons, and the neurons look like little wires. So you can see you have your large cell body right here, okay? And then coming off of that, you have your dendrites and your axons, which act as the wires that connect nerves to nerves so that they can communicate with each other. Nervous tissue is irritable and conductive, meaning that it can be stimulated by some sort of stimulus, whatever that is, and then it then sends that stimulus someplace else, which is how we're able to touch things and sense them in our brains and figure out what's going on. Or you touch something sharp and you withdraw because you send that signal from your finger all the way up to your brain, or your spinal cord in this case, and then it goes right back down to your bicep, and then you withdraw your hand to prevent further injury. So we have our neurons, which are the main cells, which are the ones I was talking about that send signals. And then you have the support cells, which are called the glial cells, or the neuroglia that surround them. Tissue can be obviously repaired, and there's varying differences in how well different tissue types regenerate or repair themselves. Regeneration is replacement of the destroyed tissue by the same type of cells. That's the optimal thing. So if you cut yourself, you want to not create scar tissue, you want to heal yourself to create the exact same tissue type again. Fibrosis is when that initially, and hopefully some of that gets remodeled and goes away and you get regeneration, but fibrosis is the creation of scars. Some tissues will only be replaced with scar tissue. Okay. And the determination of the method really depends on which tissue type is damaged and also how severe the injury is. So some tissues will regenerate really well, but still can form scar tissue if it's a serious enough of an injury. Think of like your skin, for example. Other places like your heart will never replace that tissue type with normal tissue. It'll always be scar tissue. So what happens in tissue repair initially is that the capillaries themselves will become leaky. And let's see here, will become leaky, and they will introduce clotting proteins to help wall off that injury. So when you cut yourself, you're cutting through capillaries, so they leak, the blood leaks out. The clotting proteins, the fibers, will wall off the injured area, and hopefully, eventually, what will happen is you'll have an initial formation of fibrous connective tissue, and then it gets regeneration of the surface epithelium. But if you cut yourself bad enough, like I've cut my thumb, I know you probably can't see it, there's like a pretty long scar on my thumb. I cut it with a knife when I was trying to open fishing poles. It was really bad. I almost passed out from it. It was really painful. But I ended up going to the hospital, and they had to reopen it and inject it with like numbing solution, and then they had to sew it up. It's brutal, but I still don't have proper feeling in here because underneath there's some scar tissue on the outside, but all of those nerves and things, there's pretty much just scar tissue that was repaired, and it hasn't gotten any better. So I'm going to perpetually for the rest of my life have like a numb spot in the middle of my thumb from that. Let's watch this video here. Let me see if I can figure out how to.
Soft tissue organs in the body repair injury through a multi-step process that begins as platelets from torn vessels work to form a mesh-like clot that prevents blood loss. Inflammation in the area occurs as tissue repair begins in the damaged area. Mast cells release histamine that dilates blood vessels and increases blood flow to the repair site. White blood cells, called neutrophils, and macrophages work to consume bacteria and remove damaged tissue and debris. As bacteria and dead cells are removed, the proliferative phase of wound healing begins. Fibroblasts build new tissue by secreting collagen that takes the shape of the original tissue. During remodeling, the final phase of wound healing, the tissue created by the fibroblasts matures and regains its normal function.
Okay, so tissues that do regenerate very easily, your epithelial tissues regenerate very easily. And it's not because of their great blood supply, but because they are so thin, they are able to get nutrients from the underlying blood supply that's below them fairly well. Your fibrous connective tissue and bones heal fantastically. So like if you break a bone, that's a very serious injury. The bone becomes back stronger, and we'll talk about that process when we get into the skeletal system more. But those are two fantastic, epithelium and bone are the two best regenerating tissues. As I said, connective tissue, some of that fibrous connective tissue, like if it has good blood supply, tendons can regenerate. But they don't regenerate great unless they have a good blood supply. Tissues that don't regenerate very well, skeletal muscle. So if you pull a muscle, that's usually a multi-week injury to get back to normal, and it has a high rate of re-injury risk. It does not really regenerate great, though it can regenerate eventually. So that would be the one that regenerates not so well. And then the ones that do not regenerate at all, cardiac muscle, so your heart tissue, once that tissue dies, that's why heart attacks are so serious. Once that tissue dies, it will never come back. It'll just be replaced by scar tissue. And then nervous tissue, specifically within the brain and spinal cord, if you destroy part of your brain, it never recovers. It'll always be destroyed. You cannot replace or create new nervous tissue within your brain and spinal cord. Again, why spinal cord injuries are so severe, you can't get them to make their connections again after they've been severed. All right, that is the lecture on tissues. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me in class or in office hours.